experience of being a developer in the renewable gas space for about 35 years, and since I'm only 39, it gives you some idea of how precocious I was when I started in this business. But I'm going to give the developer's perspective on this panel and the next to give those of you who are in the LDC community a view of what we suffer through trying to get these projects into commercial operation. And I'd like to give you some brief overview of the panel members here before we start, and then I'm going to give a little bit of background about policy and how it impacts, because our topic today is RNG policy and market forces. So I'd start to my immediate right here is Brian Jones, who is Senior Vice President of MJ Bradley and Associates. I'm going to let you read the whole bio. I'm going to give you an abbreviated version of Brian. He began his career as a consultant at MJ Bradley and Associates in 1998. And Brian advises energy sector clients on strategy and policies related to climate change and sustainability. Brian's current efforts are focused on the role of natural gas in a low-carbon future, corporate sustainability strategy, and transportation electrification policy and strategy. Previously, Brian worked on energy and environmental policy for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Next to Brian is Johannes Escudero, and he is a founder and chief executive officer of the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. And the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas is the public policy platform and advocacy and education voice for the renewable natural gas industry in North America. I'm not going to go through all the purposes, because you're going to hear a little bit from Johannes and us later about the coalition. Next to Johannes is Sanal Patni, who is a program manager for Pacific Gas and Electric. Sanal is she's involved in PG&E's research and development group, and she works to support new policy adoption within the gas operations and is responsible for reviewing new policies, state and federal legislation and initiatives, and working with gas operations to understand the impact of these proposed strategies and policies. I'm going to give a very abbreviated description of Jim, since you heard him on the last panel. Jim Lucas is the market development manager for Southern California Gas Company. I won't repeat his bio there. I would, however, like to start the discussions today by giving you some insight and a little bit of background, perhaps from a developer's perspective, about the importance of policy and the impact on the marketplace. And in order to highlight the importance of policy and how it affects the market for RNG, it's useful to understand a little of the history of RNG projects. The first RNG projects, or pipeline quality biomethane upgraded from a waste biogas resource, were developed in the 1980s. One of the earliest was at what was then the largest landfill in the United States, the Fresh Kills landfill on Staten Island in New York. Now, most early RNG projects were developed at landfills due to the economies of scale available in processing large quantities of biogas, in this case, landfill gas. At the Fresh Kills RNG project, landfill gas was upgraded to pipeline quality RNG and injected in what was then the natural gas pipeline owned by Brooklyn Union Gas, which is now part of National Grid. The same type of gas processing equipment that was used in the natural gas industry to remove impurities from gathered fossil natural gas to upgrade it to pipeline quality was used to upgrade biogas, or landfill gas, to meet the injection standards of applicable natural gas pipelines. Now, that remains true today. Virtually all RNG projects developed through 2007 processed landfill gas, or in rare cases biogas, and sold such RNG on a merchant basis, basically index price natural gas, as a direct substitute for fossil natural gas. Now, when natural gas prices were high, those projects did very well. When they were low, many of such projects failed. An example of this phenomenon was the RNG project that first began operations in 1999 at the McComas Bluff landfill, the largest landfill in the state of Texas. The first three owners of this project went bankrupt when natural gas prices dropped. I'll tell you a little bit more about this project in a second. By 2011, of the nearly 600 energy projects listed by the EPA's Landfill Methane Outreach Program in the U.S., less than 30 were RNG projects. RNG project developers strive to meet the requirements of the secret formula. Now, you may ask, what is the secret formula? Now, you understand, of course, that if I share with you the secret formula, it will no longer be a secret formula, but lest I be accused of merciless teasing, I'm going to share that with you. If you're inclined to take notes, this might be the time to do it. So here's the secret formula. Revenues must exceed expenses predictably. Now that's easily stated, but in the development world, not so easily achieved. Typically, due to the lack of economies of scale, it will cost more to produce an MMBTU of RNG, and this relates to one of the questions I think asked earlier in the sessions, than it does to produce an MMBTU of fossil natural gas. By way of example, it may cost between $5 to $6 to produce an MMBTU of RNG at a landfill. Now, if fossil natural gas is selling for $3 per MMBTU, do you recognize the math problem that develops in trying to meet the requirements of the secret formula if RNG is sold on a merchant basis as an equivalent to natural gas? Well, in 2007, I recognized these problems, and in purchasing the assets of the RNG project at the McComas Bluff landfill with a partner through a bankruptcy proceeding, I negotiated a long-term take-and-pay RNG sale agreement with Shell Energy North America at double-digit pricing at a time when natural gas was selling at Waha Hub in Texas at less than $2 per MMBTU. Shell Energy was willing to pay such price since it resold the RNG to a municipal utility in California where it was efficiently converted to renewable electric power to meet that utility's renewable portfolio standard requirements. The project was transformed into a financial success, and the requirements of the secret formula were met. So what made that possible? Well, the recognition of the impact of applicable policy in effect in California on the pricing of RNG, in this case the RPS standard, was what allowed that project to receive the double-digit pricing that has sustained it since 2007 when we acquired those assets. In the ensuing 10 years, there have been a number of changes in policy affecting the RNG industry. I'm proud to say that in 2011, my company, Cambrian Energy, was one of the 8 co-founding companies of the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas, which is the trade association that represents all sectors of the RNG industry in North America. It now has more than 100 members, and as part of this panel, you will learn a little more about the coalition and its work to assist the RNG industry when you hear from Johannes Escudero, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the coalition. Since the formation of the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas, the number of RNG projects in the U.S. has more than doubled, and is currently experiencing accelerated growth with new projects being developed not only at landfills, but at anaerobic digesters and wastewater treatment plants. The economics and sustainability of RNG projects are driven by policy. So the topic to be covered by this panel is of utmost importance to the RNG industry. We are fortunate today I have a highly experienced panel to share their insights on RNG policy and market forces. And I'd like to add that for those of you who may be watching this on the web, there is a capability for you to send in questions, and we'd be happy to go ahead and address those questions if you will just send them using the app through which you're watching this presentation. And with that, Brian, I'd like to ask you to come up and address the first panel.
Thanks, Evan. Just click on the one. Okay. Easy enough. Great. It's easy. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to AGA and EPA for having this workshop. I think it's, as I said in the first panel, it's very timely, and it's great to have such a large number of people in the room. I think it's just fantastic. So I'm going to step back and talk more of a big policy picture and give a perspective from my work with the Downstream Natural Gas Initiative, as well as some of my other work around achieving deep decarbonization of the economy. So I'm going to try to set the stage and then move quickly. I only have 3 or 4 slides to get to the other speakers and conversation. So I'm going to start with, again, I said big picture. So economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction targets. They exist in many states across the country. Not all the states, of course, but many states across the country, as probably a lot of you know in the room, have very aggressive greenhouse gas economy-wide reduction goals, which really will require a complete transformation of the way that we generate electricity and consume energy, both on the transportation side and on the building side, as well as manufacturing side of the equation. These are significant emission reductions that states have set a course for with interim targets and near-term strategies. As you can see, a lot of the coastal states, as you probably know, that have these progressive policies are far down the road. California being one that comes up in a lot of conversations this morning and elsewhere with public policy on decarbonization. But the simple fact is that, you know, from delivered fuels and natural gas supplied by utilities, there's ongoing conversation about how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from these 2 areas to help states and the nation as a whole achieve some of these aggressive targets. So with that, there's been a slew of decarbonization analyses that have been done. I have a few pictures of some recent ones. In the middle is the United States mid-century strategy for deep decarbonization that came out at the end of last year. But 2 recent ones, NRDC came out with one last week to align with Climate Week in New York City. It's actually, they had been working on this for several years. And then at a regional basis in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic and Northeast states have been collaborating on what they call strategic electrification. So again, the strategy that is really coming to the top, rising to the top in a lot of these states and through a lot of analyses, is electrification of a lot of end-use petroleum and natural gas and delivered fuels. So you have a focus on electric vehicles and the transportation side. You have a focus on heat pumps, both for water heating and space heating on the building side, commercial and residential. And, you know, more often than not, in the manufacturing and the process heat side, there's a lot of throwing up of the hands, saying, well, electrification really doesn't work for a lot of these different sectors. And biogas and biofuels will need to step in and serve a lot of that demand for end-use heat and processes. So, you know, but in general, they all sort of come with the same conclusions, these deep decarbonization analyses. We have to really increase energy efficiency, so that's electric and natural gas, as well as vehicles. So anything that combusts fossil fuel, we need to increase the energy efficiency of the process, decarbonize electricity completely. And, you know, there's been a lot of progress on fuel switching and integration of renewable electricity, obviously, into the marketplace. Mentioned electrification and fuel switching. And then finally, which is the purpose of this conference, right, is decarbonizing the fuel that's delivered to the end-use customer. So just a very simple graphic of where natural gas is consumed throughout the United States. Of course, on the left side, manufacturing is the lion's share of end use in the U.S., with a lot of process heat, you know, being over a half of the total consumption. You know, boilers and other processes, and even space heating in the manufacturing side. So you can see in a lot of these deep decarbonization analyses pointed out on the process heat side that there needs to be something other than electrification, and that something other is decarbonized fuels, efficiency as well. On the commercial buildings and the residential side, you know, it's space heating and water heating are the dominant sources. And in those, there's electrification technologies, but as well as potential sources for biogas and biofuels. Oh, wrong way. So some of the challenges and opportunities and even some potential solutions down here to speak to from a policy perspective. We've heard enough, and I think we all know about the cost differential between RNG sources and conventional, traditional natural gas. Utilities have the extra challenge of least cost requirements through public utility regulatory structures, which is a key barrier on the utility side. Gas availability, RNG supply. There's national assessments the AGA has done, GTI has done some. There's been some regional assessments. I know there's some ongoing state assessments. But getting more information for policymakers around the supply and what it looks like at a state level, at a regional level, I think is critical to getting it out there and educating policymakers. Some of the potential solutions. There are few utilities out there, both in Canada and the U.S., that have voluntary retail products that echo the growth of renewable electricity in this country, where it started out, again, with customers that at a retail level were interested in signing up for a lower carbon product. Fortis BC, DTE Energy, Vermont Gas, I think back the first week of September, had their program approved for a voluntary customer offering. That's a way to get the customers who are voluntarily signing up to pay for a part of the program. And I think some of rate basing, some of the other costs up to a cap is a good way to go, or a best practice to learn from. We heard earlier as well, and I think a lot of as Sanal and I were sitting there together, a lot of the questions came up in the first panel that I thought we were going to be getting into on this panel. So I'm sorry to be a bit repetitive, but large end users. We do a lot of sustainability work. A lot of end users that have really aggressive sustainability programs and GHG reduction goals. They've gotten to everything but their natural gas use. They can increase efficiency. They can put solar on their buildings. They can co-develop solar, utility scale solar or wind farms. They can buy RECs. They can buy renewable electricity, but they can't do anything on the gas side. And so they're looking for solutions on the gas side to really decarbonize their product and meet their own internal goals. Just last week, the Renewable Thermal Collaborative was announced. World Wildlife Fund, together with the city of Philadelphia and several large companies come to the fore. Like one of them, Mars, one of the most aggressive and progressive sustainability companies on sustainability out there, has stepped forward and said, "Hey, we need an option to support to address our own footprint of our gas usage." Jim mentioned renewable gas standards, following on renewable portfolio standards. I'd say without an assessment of the available supply in a jurisdiction, it'd be very difficult for policymakers and others to want to jump into that policy. But clearly, state policy action is necessary. I think education is necessary. More often than not, when we're in a room with either environmental advocates or state policymakers, energy policymakers, when RNG comes up, they say, "Oh, is that really an option? Is that viable?" Education is critical to getting people to get it into the conversation. Back to the NEEP electrification document and study. I was at a workshop and I said, "Did you look at biogas and biofuels?" I said, "Well, the same answer. It's really folks are focused on the strategic electrification or the efficient electrification. And I think it's really imperative that utilities bring it up and keep continually mentioning the RNG opportunity and having policymakers, come up the learning curve on it as well." And I'd say that the last element here is really when there is that regulatory dialogue around a program. I think the cost-benefit analysis of the of the program itself needs to consider the local economic benefits, the air quality co-benefits, the direct and indirect GHG reduction benefits as well. And that's something that a lot of commissions don't look at now. So I think when you're looking at new business models for utilities and new ways about doing things, it comes back to the cost-benefit analysis used in the jurisdiction that you're in, and rethinking that as well as rethinking the business model and arrangement that the utility is involved with. So I'll stop there and be looking forward to the conversation that follows. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. Sanal, you're up next. Sanal Patney is program manager of PG&E, who will discuss the RNG role in state regulations.
Good afternoon. I hope everybody is still with us. I know that food coma might be setting in, so I think this is interesting. Hopefully everybody else does, but I'll try to keep it short and then definitely open to questions on the panel. So as you probably heard, the state of California is pretty progressive and very aggressive with our climate change policies, and we're going to talk a little about that. At PG&E, we want to provide safe, reliable, affordable service, and we think environmental stewardship plays a huge role in that. In California, when we talk about climate change, it's looked at in basically two different buckets. One is, how do we reduce leaks? How do we reduce the emissions from our existing system? And then the second part is what we've really been talking about here is displacing that fossil fuel with renewable natural gas. So at PG&E, when we think about how we actually start looking at these policies and implementing them, there's a few things we always have to keep in mind. First of all, you heard Don say it, and I think some of the other utilities have said it as well, is, we have to maintain that safety. You've heard gas quality come up. We need to ensure that we're providing safe gas and ensuring reliability of our pipeline. And then something that we've been looking at PG&E is understanding that mixed fuel portfolio. We've mentioned a lot about using RNG for transportation, and we have the electric side of our business as well, right? So it's really understanding where it makes sense to use electrification, for example, in light-duty vehicles, and where we can see some GHG reductions with using natural gas in the medium and heavy-duty fleets. There's always ongoing research that we like to engage in. We're looking at partnering with Southwest Gas and SoCal and GTI on a study to look at woody biomass and its feasibility to produce RNG. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're looking at cost-effective solutions and minimizing that rate impact to our customers. The SB 1383 proceeding, which I'll get into a little more. We've talked a little about the cost for extending that transmission pipeline and how that does really have an impact on rates. So one of the things we've proposed is actually trucking biomethane. So instead of building out that transmission pipeline, transporting it with a truck to the site, which we believe would have significant cost reductions. And then finally, engaging stakeholders. We've talked about educating the public, educating agencies, really working to make sure that it is successful and we are supportive of RNG, but also doing it in a way that makes sense. So when we look at the foundation of the policies, we really have the targets, which look at the 40% reduction targets overall, 40% reductions in specifically methane, which is being driven by the Air Resources Board in California. And that really is kind of the main drivers of the rest of the policy work. But some of the other policies you see in the next slide, I'll get into details, which will be available, and I'm not going to get into all the specifics right now. But then it's also understanding, how the utilities and the developers work together to implement this work, right? So we've talked about understanding gas quality. We've talked about the potential for a procurement mandate, which, there was some sprinklings of it in the legislation this year, but it didn't pass. And so I think we're probably going to see that come up next year and see more of an emphasis on trying to get that procurement mandate, which SoCal Gas and PG&E are both supportive of. And then really kind of what we've been focused on specifically related to RNG is SB 1383, right? So it's saying we need to create RNG, and we're supportive of looking at landfills and wastewater treatment plants. But when you look at the overall emissions in California, around 50% of that comes from dairies. And so that's something that the Air Resources Board has also kind of highlighted, which led to SB 1383. And so SB 1383 is an open proceeding right now. I believe last week they released their scoping memo. And the CPUC has really been tasked with, establishing 5 pilots or a minimum of 5 pilots. I know that's very key. A minimum of 5 pilots by January of next year. And they're really been tasked with figuring out the funding mechanisms, selection criteria for those, because it's more than just looking at cost considerations, right? You want to make sure that you're looking at, are there some projects that are already of that scale that can utilize their existing equipment? And then also really making a framework that you can implement more broad scale, right? Because we want to look at these pilots and take the learnings from them to then apply it more broad scale. The second piece of that proceeding is being led by the Air Resources Board, and it's specifically related to the low carbon fuel standards and the financial mechanisms to offset the developer costs. Jim talked this morning a little about the incentives that are already in place, the $3 to $5 million. We understand that that's a great start, but there's more that needs to be done. And as these developers are working to scope these pilots or just projects in general, understanding the downstream market, understanding the stability in those credits is critical for them as they're looking at project viability. Additionally, as the CPUC and the ARB are looking to evaluate these projects, that also plays a role in that. So for PG&E, what are really our next steps as we kind of move into this? First off, we want to ensure we have an effective biomethane interconnection process. Jim's going to cover some of the work that SoCal is doing, but we've typically, when we look at interconnections, they've kind of just been a one-off thing that we look at. We understand that for us to really be part of the solution and to really incorporate RNG into our work, we really need to develop a team, right? So it's not just pulling employees and saying, hey, I have this project, can you review it? It's really developing a team that understands this, developing a procedure that can be repeatable, and really providing more clarity. So there's a lot of ongoing efforts internally to kind of formalize that process, and we've internally been throwing around the term building a machine. So as we see these ramp-ups, not just for the SB 1383 proceeding, but we anticipate seeing more of these type of projects hit our radar, we want to make sure we're equipped to address them. Continue to advocate for trucking biomethane. We think this is a great cost-effective solution to just building out transmission pipelines. And we want to continue to educate the public, the agencies, that this is a safe practice and something that should be at least considered for interconnection and flexibility. Engaging stakeholders. Again, this is teeing on the same point. We want to make sure that we're starting to have those conversations that Brian was mentioning. We're providing the education. We're making sure that RNG is actually going to be part of the conversations moving forward. And then also having that environmental partnerships where we're working with disadvantaged communities to show them, if they're implementing the use of renewable natural gas vehicles, they can see some emission reductions and air quality improvements today, right? And so it's really just kind of working with those teams to make sure that they're on board. And the final piece is really ensuring that there's a market for renewable natural gas, right? So we can, as a utility, support the projects and the development, but we want to make sure that there's stability in the market for using it in transportation, but that there's also a market in transportation. In the state of California, we've seen support for electrification of light-duty vehicles. There isn't anything that explicitly spells out the use of renewable natural gas for fleets for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. So trying to continue to promote that and also work with different fleets and provide this alternate option is also something that we're going to be looking into doing. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanal. I'd like to bring to the podium Johannes Escudero, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas and who has played a prominent role in shaping policy that supports and encourages the growth of the RNG industry. Johannes will be providing an RNG industry policy and market overview. Johannes?
Thank you, Evan, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the amount of effort and energy you've expended to be here today, to attend and participate, to engage in dialogue, which is where it all begins. The coalition would not be here had a question not been asked along the lines of what is renewable natural gas. In fact, it was a frank conversation over a cup of coffee in our living room that was the catalyst for the very formation of the coalition for renewable natural gas itself. So never underestimate the power of socializing, even within the context of your own familial neighborhood circles of influence. What could come of that? Briefly, I want to give you an introduction to who we are. As Evan mentioned, the policy advocacy platform for the North American RNG industry. I don't think we need to delve quite as deep as I thought we might into the feedstocks and defining what renewable natural gas is, although believe me, there is a glossary of terms, particularly as we expand our footprint and are successful both at federal and state provincial levels in putting forth statute and regulation. There's no shortage of terms. I think Chris Bull acknowledged earlier when we first began, we being the coalition 6 years ago, everything was biogas. And we quickly realized that that's the raw methane effectively that we're talking about that needs capturing increasingly and upgrading in order to meet a variety of end-use applications. But I do think it's important we at least take a quick view into the renewable natural gas production, both glancing backward at history so as to appreciate the trajectory of where the industry is going in terms of where we've been even more recently. Again, by way of introduction, the Renewable Natural Gas Coalition is a 501c6 trade association, so 60% of all member dues are tax deductible. We provide a policy platform and advocacy and education voice for the industry. We have international members, including in Canada, Brazil, Italy, Denmark, and the UK, but we focus and deploy our resources. We have no pretense that we understand the politics that take place on an international platform. Difficult enough to keep up with our own in DC, not to mention California and then all points in between. But we represent each sector of the industry, including producers of more than 90% of all the renewable natural gas supply in North America. And I would highlight 98% of all the RFS qualified cellulosic biofuel under the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, which, as you've heard already, is the principal policy driving production for our industry. And really the beauty of the coalition, this is a shameless pitch for your engagement as a member, is that really we create an opportunity for competitors to work together for the common good under the umbrella of the coalition. There's a brief snapshot of our leadership and general members, as well as the nonprofit members that we partner with, including but not limited to the Department of Energy's Clean Fuels and Clean Cities programs in a variety of cities. Really our mission and why we exist is to advocate for increased development, deployment, and utilization so that present and future generations have access to this domestic clean fuel and energy supply. And our philosophy, which really undergirds everything we do, is that ultimately advocacy and education is what influences public policy. Public policies are what influence and shape or eliminate markets. Those markets drive demand, that demand determines value, and there's an inextricable nexus between revenue, value, and sustainability. Our priority, the filter through which we funnel all engagement opportunities, and there's no shortage of them, as you can imagine, is will our engagement in this particular policy, be it legislation, regulation, potential policy making, will it enable the RNG industry to double the number of projects that currently exist and operate today by the year 2025? This was a priority we established as an organization in 2015, at which point there were less than 50 RNG projects in operation. And I'll show here momentarily, trajectory suggests that we will easily surpass that mission, which at the time which it was set, was very aggressive and questioned by some. What is RNG? I'm going to fly through this, but I think it is important to note at a high level, it is a product gas that has undergone extensive high capital cost upgrading process to achieve either pipeline quality or transportation fuel grade specs, but it's also referred to as RNG, biomethane, or upgraded biogas. As I mentioned, we have published online a glossary of terms should you be interested. Essentially, post upgrading, we're talking about methane that is nearly identical to that derived and used for conventional natural gas purposes. The main difference being it comes from a renewable source versus tapping otherwise limited natural resources. What's it produced from? Just quickly, let me say, already highlighted, the largest stationary feedstocks would be landfills, wastewater treatment plants, dairies, diverted organic, solid waste, but also forestry biomass, forest product residue, fats, oils, greases, etc. Consider there's 17,000 wastewater treatment plants, more than 8,000 dairies, and nearly 2,000 landfills that do not have any sort of gas to energy project on site. So there's enormous potential. Okay. In terms of past production, renewable portfolio standards, which are state programs, and there are 37 different varieties in the United States currently, have driven production of renewable natural gas. For example, California has a 50% renewable natural gas RPS portfolio requirement. The idea of 100% RPS was entertained in SB 100 just this year. That's been tabled, will likely resurface again in January. But basically creating incentives, requirements, and acknowledging renewable natural gas as a clean, renewable electric power that displaces coal and complements the use of geologic natural gas in the production of renewable electricity. The first renewable natural gas project, technically it was a second, I realize that, but it's the oldest project that still operates today. Don Shabazpour mentioned it earlier. We love to highlight the project on Staten Island at the Fresh Kills landfill because it's been operating since 1982 in New York, transported through National Grid's pipeline infrastructure and without incident. Between 1982 and 2011, 6 years ago, which is when the coalition was formed, only 31 projects had been developed. Just about one project per year on a per annum basis. And in 2011, nearly 100% of all renewable natural gas produced was utilized as a feedstock for generation of renewable electricity. However, and this ties in with the policy and market forces that we're discussing as a panel today, with federal, state, provincial programs like the RFS, like California's LCFS, like Oregon's Developing Clean Fuels Program, like Ontario's Renewable Fuel Standard, and Canada's proposed RFS, renewable natural gas is being recognized as an ultra-low carbon fuel that can be utilized for a new generation of medium and heavy-duty vehicles, natural gas vehicles today, displacing diesel and removing dirtier diesel technology off the roadway. In just the last 6 years, 26 new projects have been developed and brought online of producing gas, injecting RNG into the pipeline. We now have more than 57 projects operating nationwide. That's almost as many projects developed in just the last 6 years as the industry developed in 30 years prior history. And you'll see here momentarily the role that policy, and not policy is not a standalone, right? It's people that influence policy. It's public engagement that shapes those policies. Ultimately is what's driving this production. This year, today, our members are on track to produce north of 375 million ethanol gallon equivalents of RNG. And the question is, why do you use EGE as a sort of measurement? That's because the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is the principal policy driving production today, was originally designed to incentivize increased production of ethanol. And so for every ethanol gallon that's produced, you generate an equivalent renewable energy credit, or a RIN, which stands for Renewable Identification Number, and those RINs can be traded, monetized, and have tremendous value today. Of that 375 million, about 24% of it is still being delivered to electric power markets. So in just 6 years, we've gone from 100% electricity to 24%. 76% of production today is being delivered for transportation fuel end use. As we speak today, 26 additional projects are under various stages of development. On top of that, 16 of our existing projects are being expanded to increase output. This is phenomenal. We have projects in 27 different states and 2 different provinces. By the end of 2018, our members will be are on track to produce north of 622 million ethanol gallon equivalents of renewable natural gas, which will include about 13% for power and 87% for transportation fuel. Between 2013 and 2015, renewable natural gas for transportation fuel purposes quintupled, and we expect that to triple again by the end of next year. To give you sort of a quick snapshot, just in California, so remember there's currently about 60 projects operating in North America, just in California, largely taking advantage of SB 1383, which our coalition supported and helped push across the goal line at 11 p.m. on the last day of the legislation in 2016. Taking advantage of monetary incentive program monies, which is $40 million sitting at the PUC to offset some interconnection cost. Driven by the low carbon fuel standard in California, and of course the renewable fuel standard, which you can participate in both at the federal level. With a reasonable investment in infrastructure, we believe this is providing our developers' criteria as an overlay and assessment on top of all the feedstock potential that exists in the Golden State. We believe it's reasonable that within the next 10 years, or 7 to 10 years, 200 dairy clusters can be developed, 100 wastewater treatment plants can be developed, and 50 landfills can be developed to produce somewhere between an additional 500 million and 2 billion diesel gallon equivalents of renewable natural gas. That's enough renewable natural gas to displace between 15 and 60% of all the diesel used in California, or to power 2 to 3 million homes on an annual basis. Yet in California, there are only 3 RNG for transportation fuel production facilities operating. And there's a reason for that. There's challenges, right? There's impediments to progress. And so quickly, if you'll allow, I've got a couple minutes left. We've sort of prioritized these, not necessarily in order of priority, but the top 6. Production cost, that's been talked about briefly already today as compared to low natural gas prices. We have to make up that delta, and the only way currently we can do that is by taking advantage of various programs and the environmental credits and associated markets that renewable natural gas is eligible for, which is not an accident. We're eligible, including for the RFS, as we mentioned, because of effective advocacy before the EPA and the Office of Transportation Air Quality in July of 2014. Prior to that, renewable natural gas was designated as an advanced biofuel, which was eligible to generate a D5 RIN, or environmental credit, which has significant value, but nowhere near the value of the D3 RIN, or the cellulosic biofuel RIN, which we are now eligible for, thanks in large part to the industry coming together, amplifying a message from an effective policy platform. But all that being said, we still struggle with, and those of you who have any investment experience, personally, professionally, understand that there's always going to be a certain amount of risk, right? There's always going to be some volatility. Well, when that delta is dependent on the perpetuation of policy-driven markets, and you consider that there's term limits in place, there's a constant need for education and re-education in our various legislatures and regulatory agencies. You have situations where obligated parties or members of the opposition are threatening these environmental programs, in some cases stalling them with litigation. What does that translate in terms of market signal? That communicates uncertainty. And some of that uncertainty is propagated as a strategic communication. I would digress long enough to say that if you're an obligated party and you have to purchase a certain amount of credits under a program, and because the increased value of RNG, those credit prices are increasing in value, you can undermine the value of the market places on those credits by calling into question the certainty of those programs, including through proposed litigation, etc. And so it's actually a brilliant move by the opposing party. Nonetheless, these are realities that we as an industry have to fight through and try to prevent against. It's certainly a challenge. Access to investment capital. I think we've done a pretty good job over the last 6 years educating the investment community, better understanding these programs and how they came into being and how long they'll exist and sort of what underwrites the programs, so that capital is starting to flow more freely, but still difficult, especially when you consider, in most cases, 7 to 10 years is required to amortize the investment capital on a project. It's hard to do that if you can only point to a program and the perception of that program is that it sunsets in 2022 or in 2020. So there's a constant need, as you can see, for education, and we've had to do this with the RFS. And I won't digress into that. There's also policy and congruence. We have state markets where you can use renewable natural gas produced outside the state if you're using it for transportation fuel, but you can't bring it into the state and attract anywhere near the same value if you're using it for renewable electricity. There's policy and congruence. And you have some regions that allow you to to benefit from tax credits if you use it for power, but if you put that gas in the pipeline and use it for transportation fuel, that tax credit goes away. So there's policy and congruence, and there's pipeline access. This is really only an issue in certain regions of the country. Those issues are being resolved largely because of the leadership of SoCal Gas on the West Coast and the support more recently from PG&E to help us through the SB 40 process to address those remaining issues that really kind of that last barrier to pipeline access from in-state resources in California. But last and certainly not least, and there's a nexus between each of these, is a demand for renewable natural gas from the transportation fuel space. In California, currently today, it's about 61% of all natural gas vehicles are actually fueled by renewable natural gas. After 4 years of advocacy and education, the Los Angeles Metropolitan Transportation Authority on May 26th, the board approved a procurement of renewable natural gas to displace their conventional natural gas utilization. Once they start fueling their buses, 2,200 of them, with RNG, the LA Metro will be the largest renewable natural gas bus fleet in the world. And that'll boost our percentage to about 91% or so of all natural gas vehicles actually fueled by RNG in California. Now, nationwide, we're somewhere between 20 and 38%, depending on which study you rely upon. But still, there's concern, and legitimate concern, that with the current production trajectory, how many years will it be before supply outpaces demand? This is a challenge that we're absolutely identifying, and we have proposed solutions. But considering that Jim Lucas is following me, and we have, I think, adequate time for Q&A, I'm just going to flash through these briefly in terms of the proposed solutions to the aforementioned impediments that we would shamelessly solicit your support as a member of the coalition and an advocate for renewable natural gas to help us work through these different impediments so that we can achieve decarbonized fuel, decarbonized pipelines for the greater benefit and good, not only of our economy, but our environment, and improve clean air and public health together. So thank you for your attention. Lastly, I'll leave you with our contact information, but welcome the dialogue here momentarily as well, including during the networking break and in the subsequent panel. So thank you again for your attention, your interest in renewable natural gas today.
Thank you, Johannes. And batting cleanup is going to be Jim Lucas from Southern California Gas. And Jim is going to be sharing his views on RNG Outreach and Education.
All right. Thanks, Evan. Good afternoon. I'm here for part 2 today. So the first part of this morning, I talked about more of case studies. Here is more of what we do to educate not only biogas producers, but other entities that, as mentioned, we need to make sure that everyone understands what biogas and RNG is in order to develop policy to support these markets. So a little bit of who do we meet with, who do we talk to? First, we talk to biogas producers. Here you'll see both landfills and wastewater plants. We have about 35 landfills within SoCal Gas's service territory, about 50 wastewater plants within our service territory. And one thing I want to show is if you look at the bullets here, where the second bullet here on landfills, first bullet here on the wastewater plants, a lot of facilities are currently flaring. A few years ago, there were some more stringent emission requirements for IC engines that were put in place by air quality districts. And so a lot of the landfills and wastewater plants were producing power on site using engines, and now they're flaring, being that they didn't have a cost-effective solution to continue to operate their engines and produce power. So that presents a large opportunity to capture that biogas, clean it, and get that into the pipeline. The other 2 markets that I mentioned earlier today too is the dairies. We have over about 1 million dairy cows within our service territory. Unlike landfills and wastewater plants, both the dairy and the organics diversion projects, they need to invest more money in these projects because they aren't producing biogas. They have the feedstock there to produce biogas, but they don't have the digesters in place to produce that biogas. As you'll see here, for the challenges to produce RNG, again, typically you need a dairy cluster to make a dairy project economical. There could be, maybe 1 or 2 dairies that are large enough by themselves to produce RNG and inject it. but that would be reliant on some very high prices that will continue for transportation fuel. We also meet with various other entities besides biogas producers, local state agencies, cities and counties, air quality districts, engineering consulting firms, and also our own internal organizations. We have a lot of account execs out there that meet with customers, and we want to make sure they have a general understanding of what biogas and renewable natural gas is. The next 5 or 6 slides I'll cover are just examples of slides that we present to customers to ensure they understand what biogas and RNG is. This is one of my more favorite slides. Kind of what Johannes mentioned is that a lot of folks don't understand the terms biogas, upgraded biogas, renewable natural gas, biomethane. I'll spend maybe a minute here to go through kind of how this works on this slide. So let's just say you have biogas coming in. Say this is the Point Loma wastewater plant, as I mentioned earlier today. They're actually using some of their biogas currently on site to produce, generation at the facility. Now, when we term conditioned biogas, you'll see in the table down here, this is biogas in its raw form. Generally, you might have 60% methane. Most of the others is going to be CO2. Generally high levels of H2S and siloxanes. When you condition biogas, all you're doing is removing some of the trace constituents. You're not actually changing the gas composition because engines and turbines can run on this type of gas compositions. But again, you want to remove a lot of the H2S and siloxanes down to lower levels. When we talk about RNG, which is pipeline quality gas, or biomethane, or pipeline quality gas, or conditioned upgraded biogas, this is where you need to change both the gas composition and remove additional constituents to get down to pipeline quality specifications. So we find diagrams, pictures really help when we talk with customers to make it clear of what these different terms is, and when you hear conditioned versus upgraded, what that means. We also talk about the LCFS and the RFS programs at a very high level. Again, we like to discuss tables and charts so they can kind of see carbon intensities of different fuels. It puts things in a different perspective when they can see that dairy biogas has a carbon intensity of negative 276 compared to, say, gasoline and diesel, what they currently are, landfills somewhere in the 30 to 60 range. Again, it just puts things into a different perspective for folks that aren't familiar with biogas and RNG. Well, we covered the price of RNG, based on if you use the commodity, the value of the LCFS and the RIN gives them a total value of what that RNG could be worth when put into a vehicle. We discuss other drivers to produce RNG. We mostly have been focused on transportation fuel, but there could be other sources that would be willing to use biomethane for their end use. One existing pathway is that RNG could be used at a RPS certified power plant. So our utilities have RPS goals that they need to meet by certain dates. Similar to solar and wind, RNG can be put into a combined cycle power plant, and the kilowatt hours there can also be counted towards that goal. There's also the self-generation incentive program. That's a CPUC approved program that provides incentives for self-generation. When they do use biogas, or they're forced to use biogas between 2017 and 2020, they can receive incentives for that project. The biomethane interconnection incentive I mentioned earlier today, again, this is a slide kind of that shows kind of how that breaks out. Another slide we're often asked about is cost and kind of how that works. To take biogas, to upgrade it, and to inject it into the pipeline. So what we did here is we took 2 different scenarios. It's the life cycle cost to produce and inject RNG based on about 1.5 million cubic feet per day of biogas for 15 years. And earlier today I mentioned about the pipeline extension cost, and it could be the longer the distance, the higher the cost of the extension. So in this first case, we said, okay, let's imagine the pipeline extension is 1,000 feet, and over here it's 2 miles. How does that play into the overall life cycle cost for that project? So you'll see if the pipeline extension is only 1,000 feet, of a life cycle cost perspective for 1.5 million a day, it's only 1%. But if you have a 2-mile pipeline extension, it accounts for 10%. So again, general ways to visually show how different things can affect the economics of a project. What's our additional delivery channels to get the word out on biogas and RNG? We do a lot of industry and community events. You'll see here that we have booths at different events. We had a biogas demonstration project here at the World Ag Expo in Tulare this past year. We also created these cows. They're kind of stress cows. There's a
Can you demonstrate?
yeah, well, there's a herd of 95 cows on this back table. Feel free to take it on the way out later today. But we realized that people like kind of things that are a little bit different, and so we had this cow. You press the button, and it makes a mooing sound for 3 times. And actually, we also developed kind of a tagline on this that says "the sound of renewable energy." So again, trying to get the word out to folks that generally don't know what biogas and RNG is through these different events. In mid-2017, we launched a renewable gas section on SoCalGas.com. It's divided into 6 different subsections. I'm not going to go through each of them here, but again, it's to educate the market. So before we used to send them different links to different items. Now we send them one link, say, hey, check it out. There's a lot of information there. We are going to expand this in the future to include other subsections. So right now we have 6, but we'll include any more. We also included put together an RNG toolkit. You'll see here there's various different pages of that toolkit. Again, general information, what the interconnection process is, gas quality standards, tools and tips if you're a developer to produce renewable natural gas. Again, these are back pages of some of those items. Again, so real simple. This is a 3-step interconnection process that you can read in a minute versus if you go through our Rule 39, which is our standard document, it's 30 pages. With a lot of terms that folks don't understand, this makes it very clear from a high level, if you're a developer, what it takes to interconnect to a SoCalGas pipeline. Some over here, again, gas constituent monitoring and measurement, how does that work? A lot of individuals may think that, for instance, we measure siloxanes continuously. We don't. It's on an annual or a quarterly sample basis. So things that you kind of hear throughout the industry that we try to clarify through this toolkit. And lastly, starting last year, we do an annual RNG workshop. Our first one was held back in October 2016. Our co-host was Energy Vision. We had it in Downey, California at our SoCalGas facility there. We had more than 180 people there from a variety of market sectors. We had various different panels that covered different topics. We are going to have a 2017 RNG workshop in Sacramento. And this year, both Energy Vision and PG&E are going to be our co-host. Here you'll see information on the side here about that workshop. It's free to register. There's no cost to attend. So if you do live in Northern California or you feel like traveling to Northern California, again, it's next Thursday in Sacramento. So again, we have different, as you can see, we have different channels to get the word out. I think it's key to get folks that don't know about biogas and RNG educated so they can develop the policy necessary to make these projects go. And thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to open the question and answer period. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to direct to a couple of our panel members for comments, and then we'll open it up for the floor. If you have questions of any of the panelists about policy issues or the RNG market forces, please speak up, and I will extend that invite to those who are watching on the webinar. If you will send your questions in, they'll direct them up here, and we'll try to get those answered as well. From a developer's perspective, we've talked about transportation. It's high-priced. The difficulty is the predictability of that pricing. And if you have to go get financing for a project and you have to appear on bended knee before a banker or institutional finance person, they want to make sure that they get their money back, and it's not easy to talk to them. In fact, a quick health tip, if any of you are in ever need of a heart transplant, you want to request the heart of a banker, because that heart has never been used. But financing is key to this. Most projects are not developed with all equity, And so being able to bring the financial community in, which means you need to have guarantees of people supplying equipment, they're going to meet certain performance standards, and that relates to things like gas specifications and whatnot, is key to getting these done. Anything else that we can get that will provide predictability to revenues and to pricing or to reduce cost is going to be important. So the wind and solar industry, for instance, have had tremendous growth, and that growth is directly correlated to a subsidy that they receive at the federal level, which is a Section 45 tax credit, which covers roughly 30% of their capital costs. Now, in days of yore, at least the landfill gas industry used to receive a Section 29 tax credit related to a non-conventional fuel. That morphed into Section 45, which now only applies to electric, those projects that produce electric power. And renewable natural gas does not produce electric power. It goes into a pipeline, so we've lost that. So I'd like to ask Johannes, if you will, plans about in the introduction of legislation perhaps in Congress to get parity to the tax treatment across the renewable energy landscape.
Well, as I think everyone understands, it's very difficult to get things done in the Congress with existing gridlock. But what we can do and what we can control and make up for lost time in is education and advocacy regarding the need for parity when it comes to revisiting various production or different tax incentives. And so we currently do not have legislation in progress, nor do we intend to introduce RNG tax-related legislation in the upcoming Congress. But we are working with key members of both the House and Senate, albeit on different initiatives, including regarding the future of the renewable fuel standard as we look beyond 2022, as we consider the reset which is embedded in existing statutes. So unfortunately, we don't have better news in that regard from a federal level, but we are making progress, we're building relationships. The reality that Evan alluded to is a result of the fact that the wind and solar industries effectively had a 15-year head start on the renewable natural gas industry in terms of industry organization, coalition, advocacy, education, not the least of which would also be political contributions. And so we have some ground to make up, and we're fervent in those efforts, including with staff in D.C., lobbyists in D.C., taking advantage of member resources in D.C., to build those relationships and increase awareness, understanding of what renewable natural gas is and the various end uses beyond renewable electricity generation.
Thanks, Johannes. One of the questions that I have for our utility participants on the panel has to do with costs, particularly in California, where the cost of interconnection, and part of this has to do with the geography of where it is, are substantially higher than they have been for members of our industry in other parts of the country. One of the factors that figures into that cost is something that's called a tax gross-up that a lot of you in the natural gas pipeline industry are aware of. And I'd like Jim or Sonal, either one of you, to talk a little bit about why that's there and if there are mechanisms working with the development community where an alternate form of construction can be undertaken to reduce that cost. And maybe you can even put some magnitude as to what that does to increase costs, percentage-wise.
All right. Thanks, Evan. I think what Evan's referring to is there's something called contributions in native capital, and I think this applies to just collectible jobs. Being that these interconnection facilities are paid for by interconnectors, the funds that are used to pay for the interconnection is considered taxable income to the utility. And so right now, for instance, for an interconnection, the tax is 22%. So say that the job was, the cost was $1 million, we had to add on another 22% of that and charge that to the developer. Now, there is we call it a safe harbors questionnaire that we have each developer fill out, where they can be exempt from paying that tax. So that's one existing pathway to avoid that tax. So again, that's kind of how it works. It's unfortunate it's there, and if there's ways to find solutions to that would help with some of the costs.
Thanks, Jim. Again, a question related to predictability of revenues and the fact that at least in the transportation sector right now, or any RNG project, it's difficult to get long-term pricing from a creditworthy entity that will support debt financing. So a couple of things have been talked about, and I'd like to get your views perhaps as to the prospects of these occurring in the near future, and that has to do with the new renewable natural gas standard imposed on utilities and what that might do to the prospects for getting, let's say, a 15 or 20-year agreement at a predictable pricing. Janice, and then maybe Sanal?
Well, I think we have made tremendous progress, as Jim alluded to earlier, over the last several years in California. Legislation has been entertained that proposed a requirement on the natural gas utility companies to procure a minimum percentage of renewable natural gas. Those efforts stalled for a variety of reasons, including, I think, unreasonable requirements and objectives in terms of procurement percentages initially, to political obstructionists that were completely unrelated to an RNG standard. However, that being said, I am, at least from a coalition standpoint, encouraged by the consensus we were able to develop between our members, including natural gas utilities, at least SoCalGas and PG&E, regarding language that was not successful at the end of session, but that may resurface again. We're talking about that as a standalone bill for California in 2018. And I'll defer to Sanal and Jim as to whether we want to talk about what those initial parameters were or not. I'll defer to you.
I don't know if I can speak about them. I don't think we can kind of get into the details of that.
Yeah, you got to join the coalition to find out.
Sorry. I think Johannes is right. I mean, I think, we are supportive of having an RGS, but it needs to be realistic, right? You can't have these targets that are so unrealistic in a short period of time to where, the ratepayers are having to incur these really high costs, right? So it's having that reasonableness review, and I think the language we did come up with kind of had that in there as well. And then, the other piece that we've also mentioned a lot today is having some policy that drives the end use of renewable natural gas, right? That kind of also sets up that foundation, that framework that then would kind of support an RGS and support these projects going into place, right? So it's kind of working it from both sides.
Can I say that we think a reasonable range would be somewhere between 1% and 5% between 2025 and 2030 of total core supply? Wink, wink.
Okay. That's a general range.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to the floor. If any of you have questions for any of the panel members here, or anybody who may be watching on the webinar have questions, please hold forth. Anybody out there?
Yeah, are there bankers or investors that are well-versed in this, that are capable of looking and analyzing projects better than just the bank down the block?
Yeah, the answer is yes to that. There are people that...
Identify, if you can, just for the benefit of the audience, identify who you are and which company would be great too. Thank you.
John Hoke, I'm with Standby Systems. I was asking if there were specific investors or bankers out there that were well-versed in the subject and willing to make loans.
The answer is yes. There are both investors who have concentrated on renewable natural gas projects. On an equity side, there are private equity funds that exist that go into this. A number of the larger developers that we have that are members of our coalition are also private equity backed. There are members of both in the banking community as well as investment banking community. And I'll show you in the next session the project that I mentioned here earlier, which is the McComas Bluff landfill, which is currently, I think, the largest producing RNG project in the country at the largest landfill in Texas. And we did a tax-exempt bond issue to complete the financial structure of that project. And there have been, I think that's been done at least 2 or 3 other times. So there are people who are very knowledgeable in this industry. There are independent engineers that are knowledgeable that, are part of some of these processes that advise lenders also. So the answer, the long-winded answer is yes.
Chris Voll with US EPA. I guess maybe Johannes, this one's a little more directed at you, but anybody that wants to answer. With the difficulty of trying to get anything done from the federal level, are you seeing other states step up and propose policy or regulatory initiatives very specific to RNG to mimic the low carbon fuel standard or what's been done in Washington state? Are you seeing more states step up in that regard?
With regard to policy incentives for renewable natural gas to the transportation fuel, yes. We are seeing a maturing clean fuels program in Oregon, in Canada, which we sort of view as the next development frontier or horizon, if you will. I mentioned Ontario is developing a renewable fuel standard and also a complementing agri-food RNG program for transportation use. And then at the federal level, Canada is putting forth a clean fuel standard, kind of crossed up the names compared to the U.S. State programs generally referred to as low carbon fuel standards, and the federal is the RFS. But anyway, to your point, yes. Even though there's difficulty passing legislation, the coalition, from our policy perspective, legislation is just one tool. It's not always even necessary to pass legislation to accomplish the intended objective from the outset. It's a device to bring stakeholders to the table. And so we've succeeded in that regard. Part of what helps that process is the EPA's administration of the renewable fuel standard. There's an annual process whereby the market is set through the renewable fuel volume obligation, which has been contentious, especially more recently as EPA has proposed a different methodology or calculus for arriving at what that market demand will be in the subsequent year. So to your point, there are states and federal, state, and provincial jurisdictions that are stepping up, that are recognizing RNG increasingly. But we're not disheartened by the fact that it's not easy to pass legislation in Congress. Right now, as I've said already, the primary policy driving production is a regulation. And so to the extent that the RFS continues to incentivize RNG, we should be good.
And just a quick follow-on to that, and I don't know how much you know specifically about the initiative that's going on in New York State, where NYSERDA is revisiting kind of their entire system, and I think it's called Reforming the Energy Vision. Yeah. I was going to ask Donald this question earlier, and maybe he'll want to chime in, but I don't know. Do you know how they're treating, if at all, renewable natural gas in that whole process? And
I'll defer my time to Don as a leadership member of our organization and on the ground in New York City. Feel free to.
They're not recognizing it. So REV does not include RNG as of now. But we were essentially saying Newtown Creek is a gas REV, so we did REV before REV, and that's the argument we've made.
So you're trying, but unfortunately it's not in there right now at all.
No, but our demonstration project that we started working on was before REV. What we would like to do as part of this, so we see, this is at least some of our vision, we see the state of New York coming out with a renewable interconnection guideline that will facilitate the state adopting some sort of policy, which then hopefully will lead to utilities, at least we're thinking about it that way, where we can offer a product that's a new product and service. And that is consistent with the spirit of this whole REV concept, new markets, new products for our customers.
Do we have any other questions? We have just a few more minutes.
Charles
Love
with Love's Travel Stops. Along the same lines of the question from the gentleman earlier from the EPA, was in California, SB 100, it's my understanding renewable natural gas was excluded from SB 100. And do you know if that was changed, if it was included and added back into an acceptable form of electricity generation under SB 100?
Great question. So Charles is referring to Senate Bill 100 introduced by the Senate Pro Tem in California earlier this year. That measure did not pass off the Assembly or Senate floor and has been parked. It's still eligible to resurface again in 2018. I expect it will in some form, whether it's the same bill number or not. The history that Charles is referencing is when that bill was introduced, renewable methane was comprised a majority of the text. I think my personal opinion is SB 100 was put forth to capitalize and build on SB 1383 from last year, which is the program you've heard discussed today, which requires utilities to rate base no less than 5 dairy projects. Unfortunately, there was tremendous pushback from the environmental justice community. And as ludicrous as it may seem, this is the reality that we face, particularly in more liberal states. The argument was that by creating incentives to capture methane, including from dairies, that we're promoting factory farm practices, and that California needs to put attention towards returning back to open pasture. Never mind the fact that methane emissions from dairies comprise the largest emissions in the state. And so that's some of the political dynamics where it's not an anti-RNG, it's an anti-factory farm practice purportedly that's a political impediment we have to get over and get through. And the reality was the pro tem told us unless you can work out a compromise with the environmental justice community, the language isn't going back into the bill. Unfortunately, we were not able to work out a consensus, so we're back at the drawing board. Does that answer your question, Charles? Yeah.
Do you have any other questions? Any questions from me? Chris?
As long as we have time, Adam.
Sure we do. You got 2 minutes.
I guess this is for Jim and Sonal. We've talked about the methane aspect of SB, the legislation in California. One part of that, though, is also the reduction of black carbon from the use of diesel. Are you seeing policymakers make that connection between RNG for vehicle fuel and the fact that it also helps to resolve the other, one of the other SLCPs in there? Are you seeing folks?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point you raise. I think that on certain levels, certain members of the legislature, same for state regulatory agencies, there's a nexus, there's an understanding. What's frustrating to us is there still prevails a strong bias to electrify the transportation sector. It's almost religious. Never mind the facts, never mind whether or not EV technology is immediately available and deployable for medium and heavy duty sectors, never mind the reliability or the cost efficacy issues, and I don't want to steal thunder from the next panel because Charles is going to touch on that in greater detail. When the reality is we need to step back and because let me just clarify, the Renewable Natural Gas Coalition supports a pathway at the federal level under the RFS program as well as in various state jurisdictions whereby renewable electricity generated from renewable natural gas used to charge electric vehicles generates the same environmental credit. That being said, we're not on the same page. It's almost as if it's biofuels versus EV, and really the common target should be removing dirty diesel technology off the roadway. That's where the low-hanging fruit lies. That's where you really achieve tremendous reduction in terms of the particulate matter, right? The black carbon you're talking about that clearly correlates with climate change. So I don't know if that answers your question. So yes, there's an awareness, but there's still not a cohesion, and that's where I would again shamelessly solicit your support. That's where we need to band together, because that argument ties into natural gas utilities and your ability to remain relevant. I mean, in California, they're talking about what do natural gas utility companies look like in 10 or 15 years? Is there still a need for their pipeline system, right? That may seem far-fetched, but there's legislation and proposals behind these theories. And so there's an opportunity really to band together here. Natural gas vehicles fueled by renewable natural gas is a tremendous bridge to achieve the kind of greenhouse gas and short-lived climate pollutant emission reduction that I think we all want. Does that answer your question, Chris? Okay.
With the recent announcement of the ARB regarding the life cycle analysis for the carbon footprint of CNG, and that change, making it less clean, along with some effect on some of the RNG, which has just recently happened, it seems that the ARB is full bent on making CNG the equivalent of gasoline and diesel as far as the LCFS is concerned. What are the plans to combat that? Particularly, I mean, if we don't see more CNG vehicles, we're not going to have a market for RNG. That's my question.
It's a good question.
No easy answer, right, John?
Well, in the words of Governor Jerry Brown, it's complicated.
So we've had some discussions with the ARB, and Mary seems open. I think there was probably, Mary Nichols is the chair of the Air Resources, of the Air, the chair of the Air Resources Board. And so I think maybe historically there was less of a tendency to support CNG. I know we've had some discussions, and I think SoCal has as well. And I think they're coming around, so there is more openness to it.
I hope you're right.
We're formulating our response, both oral testimony and written comments as well, for the record.
You probably saw a lot of emails went out.
Oh, yeah.
Just an hour ago or so.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And for all the discussion about California today, I realize I don't want to lose our audience. We have a diversity of utility companies from around the country. For better or worse, often as goes California, so goes the rest of the country. So don't fall asleep on the discussion, because it could be coming your way. And the sooner we band together to provide some rationale and reason through advocacy and education, I think we can stem the tide. Agree, disagree?
Agree.
One more real quick one, Evan. Are there incentives either at the federal or state level for vehicle conversions to CNG or LNG vehicles currently?
The answer is yes to that. There are a number of states that do have incentives. Some are in the form of grants. In fact, New York City has a substantial grant program that if you have a vehicle that operates 70% of the time in New York City and is housed there, basically, it's like an 80% grant for the cost of conversion. Pretty aggressive. Other states have 45 or 50% tax credits for the cost of conversion. There's states like primarily natural gas states. They're Oklahoma, Louisiana, those kinds of states. Colorado, interestingly, has a fairly aggressive program. So there's about, I think, 17 states that do have programs of varying degrees that help underwrite the cost of converting.
I'd heard somewhere that there was some discussion going on the classification of D3 RINs and D5 RINs. D5, the food substrate or the organic substrates being classified as the D5 RINs. Is that true? Has there a decision that has been definitively reached on that front?
Name and company again, I'm sorry.
I'm Rahul with Colorado Springs Utilities.
Fantastic. Thank you for the question. You want me to opine briefly?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say yes. And U.S. EPA has communicated in no uncertain terms that co-digestion of mixed feedstocks will not be eligible for D3, which is the highest category cellulosic biofuel RIN under the program. That food waste will never be eligible.
Yeah, it's non-cellulosic,
Yeah.
is what they've said.
Right.
Thank you.
Now, that being said, I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's the reality. That's their decision.
So in order to qualify for the D3s, I guess, can you keep the substrates separate and still qualify for the D3s?
If it's the right cellulosic substrate, it can.
It can.
Now, municipal solid waste in a landfill from which landfill gas is derived in 2014 qualifies for a D3 RIN. If you separate out those, then you're looking at things like paper and woody biomass that are cellulosic, but food waste is not. So all this area is evolving with EPA, and you have to apply for and get separate pathways approved. So it's a complicated area.
You don't have to separate them, you just have to do the math. You don't have to physically separate. Sorry, you don't have to physically separate them. So for our Newtown Creek, it will be food waste and wastewater treatment plant. So we have to do the math and say we produced, 400,000 decatherms, when we can do the math and say 300,000 decatherms was D3, and then 100,000 decatherms came from
D5.
food waste, D5. So you don't physically have to separate, meaning.
Right. That means don't jump on Chris because he's in a different department at EPA.
Charles Love. Along that same line, what you were talking about earlier when you did your presentation, it's my understanding that if you have a wastewater treatment plant, it automatically qualifies as a D3, just municipal wastewater. Once you add fats, oil, grease, or other municipal solid waste streams into your pool, it then becomes less certain how the EPA will treat that feedstock, and there will be different requirements upon the city or the producer, and it's not quite clear. I'm not sure that that's been decided yet, and maybe someone can illuminate on that.
Maybe the best person is going to be in the next panel from Element Markets, certainly.
Is Tom here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tom is going to, I think, be able to help answer that more effectively, Charles.
No pressure, Tom.
Maybe. I keep making commercials for the last session, to make sure people stay around, so.
Okay, I think our time is up, and thank you all for being so patient with us, and please thank our panelists.